Hi there. Please let your mind slow down and go at ease, and let me know in the comments where you're from. Also, what's your best tip for a peaceful night's sleep and keeping a calm mind? Whether it's a relaxing bedtime ritual, a favorite book, or a mindfulness practice, your advice could be just what someone needs. 1. Christmas intruder. It was Christmas Eve, and my wife and I had traveled to her childhood home to spend the holiday with her mom. The house was a quiet, unassuming one-story at the end of a cul-de-sac, a slice of suburban comfort that you'd see in holiday movies. It was a place where, as my wife would say, nothing bad could ever happen. We settled into her old bedroom for the night, drifting off under the familiar warmth of blankets and the gentle creaks of the house settling around us. Then, at around 3 a.m., a piercing scream jolted me awake. It was my mother-in-law's voice, unmistakable in its raw terror. In the darkness, I froze, my mind struggling to shake off sleep, my heart hammering as the scream echoed through the house. My instincts kicked in, and I threw myself out of bed, feet hitting the floor as I stumbled into the hallway. The scream had come from the kitchen, a sound so raw and filled with horror that it sent a chill down my spine. I rounded the corner to see my mother-in-law standing in the hallway, her face pale, eyes wide. Her gaze was fixed on something behind me, something in the kitchen. I followed her line of sight, and there, in the dim light spilling from the street lamp outside, I saw it. A gaping hole in the flimsy door that connected the kitchen to the garage. The door looked like it had been kicked in with force, the wood splintered and broken. My heart raced, and I turned back to my mother-in-law, who was trembling. What happened? I managed to choke out, barely keeping the panic from my voice. It was a woman, she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. She came in. I turned toward the kitchen, my mind racing. The garage door was still wide open, and in the silence that followed, I heard the faint sound of a car engine revving, tires squealing as it sped away down the street. I took a few tentative steps forward, peering into the garage, half expecting the intruder to be waiting there. But it was empty, save for the shards of the broken door scattered across the floor. The police arrived within minutes, and we all sat together in the living room, still shaken, as they questioned my mother-in-law. She explained that she had woken up to a strange noise, something between a scrape and a thud. Curious, she had gone to the kitchen to investigate, only to find a small framed woman squeezing through the old doggy door in the garage, her eyes wild as she forced herself inside. The woman had spotted her immediately, her lips curling into a sly smile. But my mother-in-law hadn't backed down. In a moment of sheer instinct, she had screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice slicing through the silence. The woman had faltered, startled, and then bolted back through the garage, kicking the door open in her rush to escape. The police theorized that she was likely part of a team, a smaller woman sent inside through the doggy door to open the main garage's door for her accomplices. They explained that burglary teams often used these tactics, sending in someone who could fit through small spaces to quietly let in others. In the end, nothing was stolen, and we were left with only the unsettling memory of the woman's faith and the realization of how vulnerable we had been. The next day, we bought the heaviest, most secure door we could find, installing it with the hope that it would keep out anyone who dared try again. But to this day, I can still hear my mother-in-law scream, raw and filled with a terror I hope never to hear again. 2. Obsession at the store. In Florida, I worked at a little pharmacy that served as a hub for the locals. It was a small town place, and as one of the regular cashiers, I got to know many of the townsfolk. One of them was a man named David Elrod. David was lanky, with glasses that magnified his eyes to an unnerving degree, and his thick, frizzy blonde hair made him hard to miss. He'd come in 2 or 3 times a week, usually picking up Diet Coke and medication for his mother. He had a quiet, almost childlike demeanor, and though he sometimes lingered at my register a little too long, I chalked it up to awkwardness. But one afternoon, my manager pulled me into his office. Spread out on his desk were dozens of envelopes, all addressed to me in a scrawling, almost frantic handwriting. My manager's face was unreadable as he pushed them toward me, motioning for me to read one. Inside was a handwritten letter, filled with oddly poetic language. David had written about watching me from afar, and wondering if I felt the same. He described my hair in vivid detail, and the way he imagined it might shimmer under the moonlight. Some sentences were underlined, others highlighted, but the words felt disjointed, erratic, and vaguely menacing. "Do you know this guy?" my manager asked, his voice careful. I hesitated before nodding. "I think so. I mean, he's a regular here, but he's a little off." The next day, David came in as usual, but this time he did something that sent chills down my spine. As I was ringing up his order, he reached out, touching a strand of my hair, lifting it as if it were something precious. "So soft," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. I jerked back, trying to keep calm, but my heart was racing. He apologized quickly, a sheepish grin spreading across his face, and left the store without another word. My manager called the police, and later that day, 2 officers showed up at David's residence to issue a formal trespassing notice, hoping to prevent him from returning to the store. But what they found went far beyond what any of us could have imagined. David had grown agitated during their visit, insisting that he had a right to see me, that we had a connection. As the officers pressed him, David's behavior became increasingly erratic, his agitation rising to a fever pitch. Eventually, one of the officers mentioned the letters, and David's face twisted with anger. He started pacing, muttering to himself. The officers realized they were dealing with someone deeply disturbed and decided to investigate further. When they returned to the station, the officer pulled up David's record and discovered a chilling piece of information. When he was 12, David had killed his mother. The realization washed over me like ice water when the police shared this news. I'd had no idea. David had spent years in a psychiatric facility, only to be released less than 4 years before, after serving his sentence. The letters were confiscated as evidence, along with other items found at his home, disturbing things that the police wouldn't fully disclose. In the end, David was taken back into custody, this time under psychiatric evaluation, though I never learned what happened to him after that. All I knew was that I couldn't work there any longer, haunted by the memory of his touch on my hair and the way he had looked at me as if I were some kind of treasure. I moved back to Oregon within a week, eager to leave behind the unsettling chapter of my life. 3. Bus stop stranger. It was late one evening, and I was waiting for the bus home after my shift at the mall. The bus stop was dimly lit, with a handful of people milling about, most keeping to themselves. I noticed a young girl standing nearby, no older than 15, looking nervously around. Then I saw him. He was a middle-aged man, reeking of alcohol, his gait unsteady as he approached her. At first, I thought maybe he was her father, coming to pick her up. He leaned in close, speaking in a low voice, though I couldn't make out the words. But the girl's face was tense, her body stiff, and I realized she was trying to back away. I inched closer, listening as he said, "Come on, honey, let's get in the truck. Your mom's worried." She shook her head, mumbling something under her breath, but he only grew more insistent, his grip tightening on her arm. At that moment, her eyes met mine, wide and desperate. I could see the fear in them, a silent plea. I didn't think, I just reacted. "Hey," I called out, forcing a cheerful tone. "It's been ages. How are you?" The girl's face lit up in relief, and she broke free from the man's grip, practically running toward me. She leaned in, whispering, "I don't know him. Please don't let him take me." I nodded subtly, draping an arm around her shoulder as I continued the charade. The man watched us, his face contorting in anger. "Excuse me," he slurred, stepping forward. "Mind your own business. This is my daughter." His words were slow, the alcohol evident in every syllable, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. I forced a smile. "She told me you weren't her dad," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And I think she'd rather wait here with me." His face twisted with rage, his jaw tightening. "You're going to regret sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," he spat, reaching for her again. I held my ground, even as he loomed over us, close enough that I could smell the sour stench of alcohol on his breath. At that moment, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A mall security guard was standing inside, watching the scene unfold. I glanced over, meeting his gaze, and he mouthed, "Are you okay?" I gave a quick shake of my head, subtly nodding toward the man, hoping he'd understand. The guard's face hardened, and he immediately reached for his radio, speaking into it as he unlocked the door. The man, noticing the guard, hesitated. He cast one last hateful look at the girl and me before stumbling back to his truck, muttering obscenities under his breath as he climbed in and sped off. The girl collapsed into a seat, her hands trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A few minutes later, her real parents arrived, rushing over to her, visibly shaken when she told them what had happened. The police arrived soon after, taking my statement, but the man was never found. I still wonder what he might have done if I hadn't stepped in that night. It's a thought that haunts me to this day. 10. Gas station horror. One Easter Sunday, my mom and I were on our way to my grandmother's house, a drive that took about an hour. We were about halfway there when my mom noticed that we were running low on gas. She pulled into an old gas station off the highway. One of those places that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The station was small, with faded red paint and festive Easter decorations taped to the windows. My mom decided to leave me in the car while she ran inside to pay, trusting me to stay put. I was only 4, but she had always taught me to be cautious around strangers and to lock the doors if I ever felt scared. As she walked inside, I busied myself with my Easter basket, rearranging the brightly colored paper and plastic eggs. A few moments passed before I noticed a man approaching. He was tall, probably in his 30s, with a scruffy beard and a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He crouched down beside the car, peering in through the window. "Hi there," he said, his voice warm but somehow unsettling. "What's your name?" I remembered what my mom had told me about strangers, so I kept quiet, avoiding his gaze. But he didn't seem deterred. "Oh, come on now," he coaxed. "We can be friends. My name's Charlie. Now that you know my name, I'm not a stranger anymore, am I?" His logic made sense to my young mind, and I hesitated, unsure of what to say. He continued, complimenting my Easter basket, his eyes flicking between me and the door of the gas station. A sick feeling settled in my stomach, and I began to wish my mom would hurry up and come back. At that moment, she emerged from the gas station, her eyes narrowing as she spotted him. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice sharp with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" The man froze, his eyes widening. In a split-second decision, he reached for my door handle, yanking it with a force that startled me. Thankfully, the door was locked, and he couldn't get in, but that didn't stop him from reaching through the open window, grabbing my wrist. His grip was rough, his fingers cold and unyielding as he tried to pull me out. I screamed, instinctively pulling back, my little fingers clawing at his hand. The commotion must have startled him, because he let go, his gaze flickering with panic as he glanced back at my mom, who was running toward us with a fierce determination I'd never seen before. He released me, his hand slipping away as he turned and bolted, disappearing around the corner of the gas station. My mom yanked open the car door, pulling me into a tight hug, her hands trembling as she checked me for injuries. Aside from a small bruise on my wrist, I was unharmed, but the fear lingered, the memory of his touch seared into my mind. My mom quickly called the police, reporting the man's description, but by the time they arrived, he was long gone. To this day, my mom still says it was the most terrifying moment of her life, and for me, the memory of that encounter remains vivid, a reminder of just how quickly things can go from ordinary to terrifying. 4. The Forest Lurker. I was around 4 or 5 years old, living with my mom and younger sister in a small town in eastern Sweden. One morning, my mom decided to take us to the garbage station to dispose of some old boxes and bags. The station was a small, secluded area on the edge of town, bordering a dense forest that stretched far beyond the eye could see. As we approached, I felt an odd sense of dread, a prickling on the back of my neck that I couldn't quite understand. My mom must have sensed it too, because she stopped suddenly, her face pale as she looked down at me. Hold on to the stroller, she said, her voice low and urgent. Hold on tight and don't let go, okay? I nodded, my fingers gripping the stroller handle as I looked up at her, confused. I had never seen her like this before, and a shiver ran down my spine. I glanced around, trying to see what had made her so nervous, but all I saw was an old, rusty truck parked a few feet away. The man inside was staring at us, his gaze intense and unwavering. My mom's face tightened, her eyes fixed on the man. He was large, with a broad frame and a face that looked strangely empty, like he was there but not really present. His eyes were locked on my mom, unblinking, and his lips curled into a strange, unsettling smile as he watched us. Then he licked his lips, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a wave of nausea through me. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening, and I felt a surge of panic as I clutched the stroller even tighter, my knuckles white. Without a word, my mom turned us around, moving quickly but calmly, her face a mask of determination as she guided us back to the car. She didn't look back, and neither did I, but the man's face haunted me long after we left the garbage station. Years later, I saw his face again, this time on the front page of every newspaper in the country. His name was Anders Eklund, a serial killer and predator notorious for abducting and murdering young girls. The realization was like ice in my veins, a memory dredged up from the darkest corners of my mind. I knew, without a doubt, that he was the man who had watched us that day at the garbage station, and I was certain he had meant us harm. The thought of how close we'd come to becoming his next victims still keeps me up at night.